Hi, in this video, we'll explore our trio of sonification tools. What is sonification? Sonification is a process that allows you to convert any form of raw, real-world data into sound. In the traditional scientific application of sonification, the goal is generally to be as faithful to the original data as possible. These three tools, Data Effects, Data MIDI, and Data Mod, allow you to be as faithful as you like or embellish the data and use any data as a starting point, even randomizing your own data or typing it in. It's really as easy as copying and pasting to get any data set into your DAW as a starting point for MIDI patterns, parameter modulation, effects processing, or even exported waveforms that can be imported into any sampling instrument and even Wavetable. To install the sonification tools, you want to put the data effects into your user library, presets, audio effects, max audio effect folder. And you want to put the Data Mod and Data MIDI similarly in the user library, presets, MIDI effects, max MIDI effect folder. You can store them anywhere on your hard drive, but placing them in the user library, preset subfolders ensures they'll be ingested and available for search in Live's browser search function. However, I have gone ahead and added them to some collections, which is where I will find them. So here we have Data MIDI, which is where we'll begin this exploration of sonification. So Data MIDI allows us to convert any string of data, any string of numbers into a MIDI sequence. This MIDI sequence will, of course, be quantized to whatever scale and key we specify in Global Hub. Now, in terms of technical sonification in the traditional sense, as explained earlier, to remain faithful to the data, some might argue that you should leave the scale chromatic, in other words, allowing all possible notes. But that's not necessarily the purpose of these tools. The purpose of these tools is to find inspiration in the data. And to do that, I personally find it helpful to use a more musical scale. So I'll select one here on Global Hub, which ensures all manifest audio devices in a set remain quantized to the same key and scale. I think I will select a harmonic minor today, and let's set it to the key of D, just so it's not default with the key of C. And you can see now that the X relay, which I don't think we'll be using today, but also crucially the data pattern, have both inherited that key and scale. For more information on Global Hub and X relay, check the videos linked below. So here is a text field where we can enter our data, and I can type some numbers in. I'll just enter 2, 3, 4, 2, and 7, 2. And for this pattern to be entered, I must hit the Enter key. And now we will have a 3-note pattern. And the way the data is interpreted essentially is that with all of these devices, whatever the lowest number is, even if it's a negative number or a decimal, it will automatically interpret that as the very bottom of the available numbers that are being output, and it will take the highest number and take that as the highest number of output. So we've got 23 as the lowest, 72 as the highest, and these are spread currently across the pitch range. We can spread the data values across these three ranges, and I can sort of constrain them performatively. So I'm sort of squishing this 3-note pattern down into a 2-octave range now. I can also pull it higher by raising the floor. And these can, of course, be inverted. So that's going to sort of reverse the direction of the melodic pattern. Now, I can also randomize a data string of a length to a maximum of 2048. So I can have a data pattern that's 2000 steps long, but which will seem almost random, but it will eventually repeat. And the depth is the range of numbers, how granular the randomization range might be. So I can go up to a maximum of 1,000. And if I set it down to 2, then we're going to only have zeros and ones. So let's check that out. So that can be useful for creating rhythmic patterns, sort of call and response. But I think I'll set it back to a depth of 100, and let's generate a new string of data there. And so at the current trigger rate of 16th notes, 64 16th notes is a 4-bar pattern. So I've essentially generated a 64-note sequence. It's just, I should clarify triggering this very basic wavetable. And so just by expanding the range of pitch and expressing this pattern of data over a larger range, we can get some really expressive outputs. Now, currently it's all outputting a default velocity of 100, but if I enable the data mapping to velocity, then I can similarly have the lowest numbers in the range, which looks like 5 maybe, will be mapped to 1, and the highest numbers that were output in the depth range of 100 looks like maybe 99. That would correspond to the 127. So I might want to make sure that I've got something a little more noticeable happening. So I'll just assign the velocity to the filter frequency. So we can see it moving around, and I'm just going to apply a little bit of envelope there. Okay, so now we can see the velocity is mapped, and we can also map the length. And so currently, by default, higher notes become longer, but sometimes it's nicer to have lower notes longer, and the high notes become much shorter, which, again, if I reduce the release time, will become more evident. So now the lower notes are much longer and the higher notes much shorter. So we're going to look at inputting some other data now. I think I have some data from NOAA, it's called, the research agency, and this is South Pole ice extent. Now, I'm going to copy this string of data of the extent of South Pole ice from 78 until 2022, all the years that are measured. And I can just copy and paste it in. And again, I have to enter for it to take. And now we can see it's 45. And there's a reason that all the notes are super high. All the notes are D4. Why is that? Well, if you might have noticed, the data wasn't prepared very well. What does that mean? There's this string that has -999 in there. So I'm just going to delete that row and recopy the data without that -999 in there. And we should get a much more dynamic range. So that -9,999 was skewing the range so that all the other values were so similar and so much higher than that very low negative number that they were all just playing the highest note in the pitch range. But now it's taken all of these much closer numbers, which are all decimals, and again, use that same algorithm to take the lowest value in this range and map it to the lowest value I'm allowing the pitch to be output at, and map it within the range specified here once again. So this is data extrapolated from this South Pole ice range that's generating this lovely pattern. Get a little reverb on there. And if I want some more bass notes, I can bring the low octave down. Now, before I get into the different trigger and play modes, it's worth noting we can see how many steps there are in this particular pattern and the current count. So if I want a more rhythmic pattern, I can enable the gate mode. And this will only allow values by default above 50%. And we can reduce that to allow more values that are above the mid-range of whatever this set of data values might be. But we can also invert it to only allow values below this data threshold. So that's going to be a lot more sparse. And we're hearing them very low. Let me bring that up an octave. So all the notes below that are being played around there. So we can get more rhythmically interesting intervals with a gate mode, and we can actually use that to create a drum pattern. Now, speaking of rhythmic interest, the trigger modes dictate the rate at which the data will be output. And so I can set this to any rhythmic interval. And have it multiplied here. And we can have the rhythmic pattern of the trigger, not the data itself, reset in bars here. So you can hear that pattern of 3/16 notes resetting every bar. Now, there are two other modes here. I can set it to a time in milliseconds, which, if I set it to a really short value, can be great for turning the data into sort of tonal clouds. And we can, of course, transpose all this up or down within the current key and scale in semitones or octaves. Okay, but that's a bit too rapid for me. I think what I'll do now is, before switching to the final trigger mode, I'll write a little pattern in, and I'm going to tell it to not receive the incoming pitch from this pattern. And let's set the trigger to MIDI and play the clip. So this allows me to program an arbitrary rhythmic pattern at which the data will be triggered to advance through the steps. And you can see the counter here moving up at an irregular interval, rather than if I switch back to the BPM here. I'm going to bring that velocity up. I don't want it to go down quite so low. In fact, I'll just turn the velocity off and they can all be 100. Okay, so let's go back to our single 16th note pattern. And to really hear it against the kick, I'll enable some swing. And we can delay the output by a rhythmic interval times this number, which at 0 means no delay. So I've just specified to delay all the output by 3/16 notes, plus this millisecond value. So you can do all sorts of weird, funky stuff there. You can also hold all the outgoing MIDI. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now is show the play controls. So I can reset to the beginning of the data pattern manually there. I can also pause it here. Now by default, when it receives MIDI, it will ignore it in free mode. But if I set it to gate mode, it's only playing notes now when those are triggered, but it's still, the pattern is running at a 16th note rate. So these notes are just allowing it to play. Let me write a more simple MIDI pattern in here. So in gate mode, essentially, it will only play the data pattern output while notes are held. Side mode, inversely, only plays when there are no notes. But then we've got two other modes here in the same menu. Gate pause, right? Because right now the pattern continues to run when the note is stopped, but now you can see down here with the counter, the pattern stops and restarts with each note on, and same with the side pause. As opposed to, just to review, in the default gate mode, it keeps running even when we're not hearing it. So it depends how you want to express the data. I've also got an arpeggiator mode, which is similar to the gate, but restarts with each new note on. So you can see it restarting there. And if I press stop and play some other notes and enable the transposition, now I can also use the gate pause with the receive to transpose and continue the data, picking up from where it left off. So the ARP mode restarts from the first data point, whereas the gate pause mode continues playback from a specific point. Now, there are a few really important modes we have not yet explored, and I think I'll just go back to the free mode to explore that. So first of all, the data by default will advance in a forward direction. We can also reverse the direction of data playback. We can also cycle, so it'll go forward and then backward, as we can see here. So it got to 1 and then it moved forward from there. We can also set it to a random mode. So it's going to select random data points within the current selection of data. I'll go back to forward mode and tell it to reset every bar. So we're going to see this reset every bar. So it's only playing 16 of the 44 data points. So this reset interval measured in bars can allow you to kind of select a pattern within the data. I'll turn the gate on to get a less straight 16th pattern. Nice. And maybe I'll transpose that down an octave or two. Now, I'll set the reset to 0 to explore the loop control. So the loop is independent of the reset. The reset will reset whatever the current loop region is at that interval, but the loop allows me to select just a portion of the data. So if I set this to around 50, it should only play 22 of the data points. And I'll disable the gate. So we can see here with the counter, it's only playing 22. And the seek is like a seek control within an old CD player. I can move around, I can advance or sort of scroll within the currently selected data loop for a different starting point. So at 15%, it seems like I've got a 7-point sequence coming out of this data pattern generated entirely from this data from Noah. One last thing that I think would be worth seeing is I'm going to place another instance of Data MIDI prior to this one. And I'm going to set it to play one note. So now I've got the North Pole ice extent, and again, I've got that -999. So the data has to be prepared a little bit sometimes. I'm just going to remove that row, and you can do all this on Google Sheets as well. This is just a CSV file. The important thing is that there's no punctuation when you copy it in, and when you paste it in, it should just show the numbers. Okay. So now we've got the South Pole data playing at 16th notes, which, because receive is enabled, is being transposed by the North Pole data every bar. So this is just to begin to show how you can use multiple data sets together in concert to do really interesting stuff. We could, of course, have two of these grouped to a MIDI effect rack and have two divergent patterns playing. In fact, let's actually try that. So right now I've got the South Pole transposed by the North Pole, but I'm just going to group this data pattern to a rack, and I'll move this one within it, and we can hear the whole note thing happening. And I'm going to set it to 16th notes. And I'm going to set this to a specific octave. I'm going to make sure they both stay in their own octave. So this one will be C2. Yeah, D2 to D4. And I don't want the octave down. So now we're hearing this harmonic interplay, and I think maybe I'll set both of them to 8th notes so it's not so busy. And oh yeah, let's allow the full loop of this data. So again, there are just so many ways to get these data sets playing with each other. And again, you can randomize for a start point of whatever length you might want. So I think I'm just going to stick with our South Pole at 16th notes there, and move it to a lower range, shift arrow down to pull these semitone values down an octave at a time. And I'm going to grab the Data Mod device. And I'm just going to copy and paste the same data set. So Command C, and then over here, Command V, and of course, Enter. And now, look at that. We've got the same data pattern available as a modulation source. It can be mapped to up to 8 parameters anywhere in the set. So now, that same pattern of South Pole ice extent is modulating the wavetable position. And we can impact this modulation data in a variety of ways. We can say, for example, only take every third data value. We can reduce the chance that data values will trigger a change. We can introduce some jitter. We can smooth the transitions. We can likewise gate the data above or below a certain point. We can change the rate. We can say that certain notes should not trigger the data with their velocity or note value. So these are exclusion ranges. Any notes outside of this range will not trigger data. And that's when we're using the MIDI mode, of course. So we've got the time, and I'll set this back to 1 and 100. So now we're taking that data and advancing through it at a rapid rate. We can also ramp between values, so that's a linear sloping. And we can switch to a bins mode as well. So now it's just going between minimum and maximum values as quantized by the data input. We can, of course, randomize a pattern here. We can tell our pattern to reset in bars. And we can select a smaller loop of the data, so we'll get a shorter repeating pattern again. So now we can see this pattern repeating with the loop of only 22%. And we can search within that again as well, finding a different starting point. We can also delay the output by these values here. We can offset the ranges and, of course, reduce the depth of modulation overall. So this could be on a completely different track at a completely different rate using a completely different data set. In fact, I'll just quickly randomize one here. Let's set a different length. 17, okay. Okay, so now I've got a 17-point cycle, but the loop is at 22%, so I'll go back and re-expand that. And again, with some ramp smoothing, we got kind of like a custom LFO sort of thing going on here. Apply some more smoothing there. So that's Data Mod. We could apply this as well, perhaps to the filter parameter of a pad or more continuous sound. But we have one more device to look at here, and that is Data Effects. So this allows me as well to copy and paste, or manually type and enter, or randomly generate any data set and apply it to a spectral filter by default. And I can manually enter and manipulate this field, which represents the original data, to adjust the filter response. This same set of data also gets applied to wavefolding distortion. So let's go to our random mode. And it gets quite gnarly. This set of data, which we can adjust here, or re-enter from any manual data set, of course, can also be used to power a finite impulse response convolution. So we've got 3 effects that can be expressed through data and edited through this table. Now there's optional output limiting, and output gain as well as input gain. With any of these devices, you can clear the data set by hitting the erase. They all have an erase, and they all have an editing tool in case you want to view the data as it's stored in the table. But let's go back and look at one last cool feature of the data effects. Now in random mode, it will display the data values, but we can't edit them. So to enter and edit new data values, I have to switch back to data mode. I'm going to paste that same data back in, and I'm just going to reduce the amount of each of these effects and show one last cool feature, which is that we can take whatever pattern this data gives us and export it as an AIFF 16 or 24-bit or wave 16 or 24-bit. So let's select a wave. I'll click Save. And I'm going to put it in this exports folder. I'm going to call it Polar Test. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to grab a simpler device. And go to my desktop and grab that Polar Test wave and drop it here. And this is the data of that Polar Test. So let me just stop playback on everything here for a moment. If I play the note once, we're barely going to hear anything because it's so short. Each one of these dots is a single sample. But if I enable the looping, and I would recommend perhaps turning snapping off, then we're going to get a waveform that we can use to make and play an instrument. So you might require a tuner to make sure it's in key, but now we can power this Polar Test waveform with any of the other data patterns we used earlier. So I could grab another instance and input some new data, but I'm going to take that North Pole data that was sitting dormantly in our rack and use it to power this waveform extracted from another data set. So I can remove that chain, and I'm just going to press pause here so we don't hear that output, and we just hear this output. Oh, and that sounds just horrendous. But we can adjust, of course, the sampler until it's sounding a little better. If it's out of tune, maybe use a tuner effect to get it in key. Adjust the transpose and detune until it's working. And of course, I think I'll grab this X relay and put it there so I can use a chord and it will stay in scale. So there's one other way we can use this waveform, and I'm just going to do a very similar thing, but using an instance instead of Wavetable. And I think I'll group this to a rack and deactivate the simpler, grab the Wavetable, and I will set it to the user mode. And again, where it invites me to drop a sample, I'll go back and grab that Polar Test sample. And there's not a whole lot of dynamism within the table on such a short waveform. but it does give us a rather different sounding tone that we can play with as a starting point extrapolated from data. So this has been a quick look at Data MIDI, Data Mod, data effects, and using the wave output exported from data effects to use data sets collected, manually entered, or randomly generated to create all kinds of new sonic inspiration for sound design, composition, musical creativity, with real-world phenomena arguably embedded at a deeper level, depending on the data sources you choose. For data sets online, you might explore Our World in Data, or the NOAA or NASA websites. There are numerous sources of data, reliable or not, and that's another philosophical conversation, is where you're sourcing the data, how it was obtained, all these kinds of things. But my hope with these tools is that it might inspire you to think about your music making process in new ways and perhaps engage with the real world in your artistic practice. For more information on our sonification tools, visit manifest.audio.